Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. There's quite a bit happening on the international scene, including things like the new US national security strategy, which is an absolute shocker, seemingly nominating Europe as the enemy of civilization and Russia as an economic partner. It makes awful reading, and I'll get to that in some detail because it has major implications for Australia. Not that you would know that from the mainstream media because there has been almost no reporting of it. Also, the Elbridge-Colby review into AUKUS has been completed and a copy has been delivered to Australia, with Defence Minister Miles asserting that it's fully supportive of the deal, as have some figures in the United States. I, of course, wouldn't mind seeing a copy of it, but of course that won't happen. I suspect there's a bit more to it than we are being led to believe, particularly on the issue of the ability of US industry to build submarines fast enough. And speaking of reviews, and the recent claim from Ministers Miles and Conroy that we have also reviewed AUKUS, as the Americans and the UK have done, I've said that the Australian claim is not true, but a bit more light has been shed on this during an interview with outgoing High Commissioner in London, Stephen Smith, former Defence Minister, who I know. During that outgoing interview, he said that at the time of the Defence Strategic Review, he and his fellow reviewer Angus Houston, this is a direct quote, I think, cast their eye over AUKUS and concluded it was fine. So let me just say, that's not a review, that's a joke. A cosy chat over a cup of coffee does not constitute a review in any accepted sense of the word, because review implies things like terms of reference and a detailed, objective study of the facts. Anyway, the previous two podcasts have been heavy on the international relations side of things, especially about Ukraine. I'll have a bit to say about that. So I thought I'd start with a few things on the domestic front, such as the announcement that there will be a new defence delivery agency. I touched on that in the last podcast, said that very little detail was available, other than it will integrate 3 existing defence capability delivery groups: the Capability Acquisition and Sustainment Group, the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Group, and the Naval Shipbuilding and Sustainment Group. And it will report directly to ministers and have control over its budget, blah, blah, blah. I said it was too early to tell because we have very little information about how this will all work. And I note, by the way, that previous reviews, like the Mortimer-Kinnaird reviews and the First Principles review, has brought in outside experts to have a look at defence very thoroughly and do their best to come up with ways of making it better. That has not happened in this case. I think it's entirely internally generated. I think a few senior defence people have phoned their very few friends or contacts in industry and had, a quick chat with them about things that could be done better. As far as I can tell, it's as detailed as that. Now, for me, while structures are important, the main factors influencing poor procurement decisions and practices are inadequate leadership and a desperate need for cultural change within defence. When I put on my industry hat and think about the things that drive cost and drive schedule, and this is sort of a random approach. First of all, when defence issues a tender, it's often the sheer volume of detail that they are after and the number of specifications that are part of the requirement. And when I was in industry, I would have conversations along the lines of, somebody in defence would be complaining, well, your solution looks to be expensive. And you'd say, okay, well, if you were to cut down your list of requirements from 2,000 to 500, we could probably deliver it at half price and much faster. Anyway, that never happened. Then there is Defence's traditional, you'd call it in football terms, the man-marking approach to project management. So for every person in industry, Defence has somebody monitoring them. Now, I don't see how that's going to be fixed by this restructuring. Then there is Defence's own slow pace of decision-making that drives cost and can impact on risk if things just drag on and on and on. So I hope that there's scope for improvement there, but I'm not sure how. I mentioned risk. The department as well has to do something about their perception of risk, namely that anything coming from an Australian company is perceived as extremely high risk, but anything coming from the United States is perceived as having no risk at all. Then the one that is frequently mentioned, a lot of changes being made after contracts have been signed. And on top of that, you have the defence posting cycle, so the project managers come and go at 2-year intervals, whether that's convenient or not. Another big one for Australian industry, and that's the overuse of the US foreign military sales system. Now, if this restructuring can address some or all of those issues, then it will make a difference. But if not, just changing people's titles won't help at all. And I was a little depressed to see Defence Minister Richard Marles saying, well, there'll be no personnel changes at all. Whoever has a job now will continue to have their job in the future. Look, I'm really not so sure about that. I think that there is scope for trimming numbers, particularly at the top end of the range. Now, as regular listeners and readers know, I believe that the system, the defence acquisition system, is in desperate need of transparency and accountability. I don't see the slightest prospect of that happening with the announced changes. I would love to be proven wrong. The basic principle is this: if people know that their poor management is never, ever going to be revealed, and if they are never going to be held account for their poor decisions, what incentive is there for improvement? None at all. Now, I noticed that amongst the analysts who have had a look at this, Marcus Hellier, who I know well, has managed to really irritate Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy by saying that the new arrangement is simply a recreation of the old Defence Materiel Organisation. Now, how anyone can be offended by anything Marcus says is beyond me, because he's always been reasonable and fact-based. So let me add to the minister's angst and resentment by adding my view that, from what I can say, yeah, it does actually look a bit like the former DMO. The minister says the big difference is that the new Defence Delivery Agency will have control over its budget. But is that really a difference? All projects have an annual budget. You can find the top 30 acquisitions and the top 30 sustainment budgets listed in the budget papers every year. So what does it mean that the agency will control its budget when all of the dollars come out of the overall defence vote? So if the minister would like to give me a call, I'll be sure to be taking detailed notes of how these improvements are going to happen. What else? The rumours were correct. There is a new aid package for Ukraine. You know, I'd like to see more. I'd probably say that about almost any aid package. Also, I see that something is being done to crack down on the Russian shadow fleet. I don't think that addresses the loophole of Russian petrol being blended, Russian oil being blended with other sources and sold in Australia. I might be wrong, but I think that the sanctions that have been announced target something else. In the last podcast, I also predicted the total fail of so-called police peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. Well, no talks have taken place directly. It's all this clown show of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner trying to do Russia's bidding, with real estate deals being dangled in front of them. And so there's just no progress at all. And there will be no progress while the US continues this sort of approach. I might say that Russia, of course, all the time is trying to foster the image that its victory over Ukraine is inevitable. And that is just not, that's been believed clearly by Donald Trump and his group of clown car people involved in all of this. But if you look at problems with the Russian economy, they're having to sell off their gold reserves. Their oil industry is in huge difficulty. We see all of the distressing clips of damage to Ukraine's energy grid and damage to apartment blocks and things like that in Ukraine. Well, Ukraine's also launching quite a lot of drones back into Russia. That doesn't get much coverage. Now, I've saved the best for last, or the worst for last. The new US national security document. It's only 30 pages. It's online. I urge everybody who's interested in the national security space to read the thing. It's one of the most extraordinary documents I've ever read, and I don't mean extraordinary in a good way. It has a number of startling conclusions, including that the US will now focus on its own Western Hemisphere itself and Central and South America, and warns that US allies, and I assume that Australia will be affected, have to do more to look after their own security. The harshest assessment I've seen is that through this document, the US has just committed geopolitical suicide. And frankly, I'm struggling to come up with a more positive assessment. And this is a reminder that the annual OSMIN talks between Australia and the United States are happening about now, and they're happening in Washington because the Americans couldn't be bothered coming to Australia. On a social occasion on the weekend, I ran that fact past a few people, and they were shocked. And they said, really? I said, yeah, they can't be bothered. And that Rubio and Hegseth, the Secretary for War Crimes, will not travel together in the same aircraft. And I said, I thought that was a salient fact. That was the view of everyone I was talking to, but not the Australian media. Anyway, so the talks are underway, and I'll be very interested to see if Australia's small defence budget comes up for discussion. The US strategy document has obviously been written by white Christian nationalists, and it's littered with praise for President Trump and contains passages such as, and this is a quote, "We want the restoration and reinvigoration of American spiritual and cultural health, without which long-term security is impossible. We want an America that cherishes its past glories and its heroes and looks forward to a new golden age." What else? "We will harden and strengthen our military presence in the Western Pacific, while in our dealings with Taiwan and Australia, we will maintain our determined rhetoric on increased defense spending." But the harshest words, or the harshest sentiment is for Europe. Russia is let off scot-free. China is referred to in benign terms. But the poor Europeans, again, a quote, but, this claim that Europe is in economic decline. In fact, the EU economy is larger than that of the US. It says, but this economic decline is eclipsed by the real and more stark prospect of civilization erasure. Civilization's being wiped out. Quotes again, "The larger issues facing Europe include activities of the European Union and other transnational bodies that undermine political liberty and sovereignty, migration policies that are transforming the continent and creating strife, censorship of free speech and suppression of political opposition, cratering birth rates," blah, blah, blah. It's just so much right-wing nonsense. Anyway, as I say, Russia gets off scot-free. It continues having bagged Europe. This lack of self-confidence in Europe is more evident in Europe's relationship with Russia. European allies enjoy a significant hard power advantage over Russia by almost every means save nuclear weapons. As a result of Russia's war in Ukraine, European relations with Russia are now deeply attenuated, and many Europeans regard Russia as an existential threat. Yeah, indeed. So there's no actual mention of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, just the use of words war and conflict. It continues ominously. The Trump administration finds itself at odds with European officials who hold unrealistic expectations for the war, perched in unstable minority governments, many of which trample on basic principles of democracy to suppress opposition. This is just really startling stuff. And rather than just my views, I often listen to others, of course, including historian and national security specialist Anne Applebaum. And she is a voice of moderation and reason. And her assessment is, this is a quote from her, the new national security strategy is a propaganda document designed to be widely read. It is also a performative suicide. Hard to think of another great power ever abdicating its influence so quickly and so publicly. European Council on Foreign Relations Senior Fellow Ulrika Franke commented, the transatlantic relationship as we know it is over. Yes, we kind of knew this, but this is now official US White House policy. Not a speech, not a statement. The West, as it used to be, no longer exists. And various news agencies, including Reuters, have reported that already, on the quiet, Pentagon officials are telling their European counterparts in Washington that the US wants Europe to take over all of NATO's defense capabilities by 2027. In other words, you're on your own. And NATO, you're on your own as well. In our region, even though Australia gets off lightly, apart from this reference to greater defence spending, Japan is already suffering. Japan is being thrown under the bus. I mentioned this last time, there's been a flare-up of rhetoric between China and Japan. Japan has been on the receiving end of some very, very harsh criticism and is not being defended by the United States because President Trump wants a big economic deal with China's President Xi. He knows Xi is a tough character who is not going to be messed with. So instead, it looks like he would prefer to turn on allies like Japan and basically say, listen, when it comes to any sort of stoush between you and China, you're on your own, pal, because we don't want anything getting in the way of some super-duper deal that's going to earn extra billions of dollars for our various tech bros. So have a think about that, Australian politicians and Australians currently in Washington, trying to deal with the United States with this outdated 20th century view of how the Trump administration operates. These are new, difficult times. The United States is in it for themselves. They are turning their back on Europe. They are turning their back on Japan. Obviously, the United States is now just totally in the pocket of Russia. And I have concerns, given China's role now as the world's second largest economy, that if Trump needs to throw regional allies under the bus to keep China and the Chinese on side, then under the bus we will be thrown. The only solution to that is a far more independent foreign policy and a far more independent defense policy. It can be done. We just need the political will and the foresight to make it happen. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.